Dante Rourke picks up his phone inside a midtown Manhattan penthouse with one single ice-cold purpose: to end a working arrangement that he believes has already ended itself. His maid, Clara Dawson, has not shown up for 3 consecutive days. No call, no message, no explanation. In Dante's world, that is not an absence. That is disrespect. He has built an empire on a code that has never once bent for anyone, not for rivals, not for men who bled for him in the dark, certainly not for the woman who cleaned his floors. He dials her number with the calm certainty of a man who has never not gotten what he wanted. The call is supposed to last 30 seconds. He will say what needs to be said. She will have nothing left to say, and it will be over. The phone rings once, twice. And then someone answers. But it is not Clara. "Please, mister, I can't wake my mommy up. She's on the floor. I'm so scared." The voice is barely above a whisper, small, trembling, 5 years old. And it does something to Dante Rourke that no threat, no bullet, no cold boardroom betrayal has managed in 42 years of surviving the unsurvivable. It stops him completely. What he finds when he races to that crumbling Bronx apartment will shake him to the very foundation of everything he thought he was. A man who has stared into the darkest corners of the underworld will discover, for the very first time, what it truly means to be powerless, and to choose to act anyway. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button right now, so someone who needs to believe in second chances finds it too. Share it, subscribe, because the next few minutes might just change the way you see the people standing quietly around you. Dante Rourke adjusted the cuff of his white dress shirt with the practiced precision of a man who controlled everything within arm's reach, and most things beyond it. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor penthouse above Midtown Manhattan, the city spread out below like something he owned, because in every way that mattered, he did. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and still, with pale blue eyes that had long since stopped registering surprise at anything the world put in front of him. Dark tattoos climbed his neck and hands, a biography written in ink that only he could fully read, the record of every dark corner he had walked into and walked out of again. He wore a dark-fitted suit, open at the collar, projecting authority the way other men project nervousness. Without effort, without intention, simply because it had nowhere else to go. 3 boroughs, 14 legitimate businesses, the careful, total loyalty of men who understood that their continued well-being was directly connected to his continued satisfaction. He had built all of it on a framework so simple it barely deserved to be called a philosophy. You delivered, or you were gone. No grief, no appeal, no exceptions. That clarity had made him one of the most feared men in New York City. It had also made him, in the particular silence of early mornings before the city woke up, profoundly and completely alone. A truth he had repackaged so many times it no longer felt like a truth. It felt like a preference. The personnel file on his desk had been placed there that morning by his operations manager, Ray Coulter, who had set it down without comment and left without being dismissed, which told Dante precisely how Ray felt about delivering it. The name on the tab read, Dawson, Clara, domestic staff. Consecutive absences, 3. Contact attempts, 0. He remembered her vaguely. Small, quiet. She moved through the penthouse with the particular invisibility of someone who had learned that being unnoticed was the safest way to remain employed. She finished her work before he arrived in the mornings. She was gone before he came home at night. In 11 months, he could not recall having once heard her voice. And now she had been gone for 3 days without so much as a word. And Dante found that very specific silence, the silence of someone who thinks they can simply vanish, to be the one variety he had no patience for. He picked up his phone, scrolled to her name, dialed. He had already decided what he was going to say. He had a version of this speech stored in a part of his mind that never needed warming up. Clean. Final. Delivered at a temperature that left no room for negotiation. He had used it on men who ran entire operations for him. Clara Dawson would require considerably less. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a sound came through the line that belonged in no version of the conversation Dante had prepared for. Not Clara. Not voicemail. Not the silence of someone who had decided not to answer. A child. Breathing too fast. Crying too quietly. And the unmistakable sound of a small person who has been holding themselves together through sheer exhausted will. Hello? The word came carefully in 2 deliberate syllables, as though she had rehearsed it. Mommy's phone was ringing. She showed me how to answer it. Dante did not move. His grip on the phone tightened without his permission. Who is this? His own voice came out lower than he had intended. Lily. A beat. I'm 5. Then, dropping to something barely above a breath. Please, mister, I can't wake my mommy up. She's on the floor and she's making a bad sound. I put a blanket on her but she won't open her eyes. I'm really scared. Every sentence Dante had prepared dissolved at the same moment. He stood up from his chair without being aware of deciding to. And the personnel file slid off the edge of the desk and fell to the floor. He did not look at it. Lily. He kept his voice steady by pure force of will. Do you know your address? Can you read it to me? A small, careful silence. Then she began to read, slowly, the way children read something memorized rather than understood. An address in the South Bronx that Dante recognized immediately as one of the hardest blocks in the borough. A place his own men took precautions entering after nightfall. Are you really going to come? Her voice shifted, becoming careful in a way that was more heartbreaking than any amount of crying could have been. Guarded, practiced. The voice of a child who has learned not to expect too much. Mommy says her boss is very important and very busy. You don't have to come if you're busy. Dante stopped. He stood in the center of his penthouse in a suit that cost more than Clara Dawson earned in 2 months, and he heard, for the first time, what his name sounded like from where she stood. Not authority, not safety. A burden too important to trouble. A man you did not ask for help because you already knew the answer. Something cracked inside his chest. Slowly. The way marble cracks. Without warning. And then, all at once. I'm coming, he said. I promise. The words sat differently in his mouth than any promise he had ever made. No calculation. No leverage. No benefit to him whatsoever. Just a frightened 5-year-old who needed someone to say it and mean it, and Dante Rourke, who had spent 4 decades being many things to many people, discovered in that moment that this specific thing was something he had never once been. He was through the door before the feeling had a name. Kane Wells was in the corridor reviewing the afternoon schedule on his tablet when he heard the elevator arrive at the penthouse level and looked up to see his employer walking toward him at a pace he did not recognize. In 11 years as Dante's most trusted second, Kane had watched him absorb a federal subpoena, navigate 2 separate attempts on his life, and sit across the table from men who wanted him dead, all without his expression shifting by a single degree. What was coming toward him now was a different face entirely. Dante. The Harlow meeting. Victor's already in the conference room with... Cancel it. To when? Cancel it, Kane. Indefinitely. In 11 years, Dante had never once canceled a meeting with his second-in-command, and those meetings were the spine of the entire organization. Victor is going to... Victor can wait. Dante read an address from his phone without slowing his stride. Call an ambulance to this location now, before we reach the elevator. Kane moved on instinct, already dialing as he fell into step. As the elevator doors slid open and he caught a glimpse of Dante's reflection in the polished steel, he paused, just for a fraction of a second. Those pale blue eyes, which had always reminded Cain of something frozen and final, were wide, alert, lit with something Cain had to search 11 years of memory to identify, because he had genuinely never seen it on that face before. Fear, not for himself, for someone else. Cain finished the call to emergency services and relayed the address, confirming a child alone with an unconscious adult. He hung up. He looked at Dante. Dante stared straight ahead at the mirrored steel, jaw locked, one hand gripping the rail with knuckles that had gone pale. "Who's at the address?" Cain asked quietly. Dante was silent for 3 full seconds. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way that meant the control was costing him. "A little girl," he said. "She's 5 years old, she's alone, and her mother is on the floor." The elevator reached the parking level. Dante walked directly to his car and opened the driver's door himself. Something his driver, Tommy, had not once witnessed in 4 years on the job. Cain barely made it into the passenger seat before the car moved. The black car pulled out of the garage and accelerated into the Manhattan afternoon, like something finally, irrevocably set free, 40 minutes to the Bronx in afternoon traffic. Dante drove it in 26. What Dante Rourke found behind that unlocked apartment door would not just change his afternoon, it would take apart, piece by careful piece, every wall he had ever built, and replace them with something he had spent 42 years insisting he did not need. The South Bronx did not receive the black car well. Dante knew the moment he turned off the expressway that he had crossed an invisible line. Not just a borough boundary, but a different country entirely, one where a vehicle like his was not a symbol of arrival, but a declaration of wrong address. Buildings crowded the narrow street on both sides, their facades peeling back in long gray strips like skin that had given up trying to hold on. Fire escapes hung crooked and rusted over sidewalks, where a group of men standing outside a corner store turned to watch him pass, with the flat, unhurried attention of people who had learned long ago to track anything that did not belong. Cain said nothing. He had stopped trying to speak approximately 4 miles back, when it became clear that Dante was not navigating so much as pursuing, and that the distinction mattered. The building was a 6-story walk-up on a block that smelled faintly of exhaust and yesterday's rain. Its front door was propped open with a folded piece of cardboard. Dante was out of the car before Cain had processed the fact that they had stopped. He did not wait for the elevator, which turned out not to matter, and because there was no elevator, only a stairwell with a fluorescent tube on the second landing that flickered in irregular intervals, as though it had been trying to burn out for years and had not yet committed. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. The door was unlocked, just as Lily had said it would be. Dante's hand rested briefly on the frame before he pushed it open, and he was aware, in the way that only truly still men are aware of things, that he was bracing himself. He did not know for what, exactly. He had walked through worse doors than this. He had walked through doors that opened onto things that did not bear describing, but he found, standing in the hallway of a crumbling Bronx building at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, that the particular thing behind this door was the one kind he had no preparation for. He pushed it open. The apartment was 1 room plus a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. A single window above the kitchen counter let in a stripe of gray afternoon light that fell across the linoleum floor and landed directly on Clara Dawson, who was lying on her side near the foot of the bed, utterly still, her breathing shallow and uneven in a way that Dante recognized immediately as wrong. And beside her, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her knees pulled together and her hands folded in her lap like a child waiting for class to begin, was Lily. She had tucked a folded dish towel under her mother's head. It was the kind of detail that hit Dante somewhere behind the sternum and did not immediately release. A 5-year-old who did not know what else to do had remembered what her mother did when she was sick, and had done it. She had pulled a blanket from the bed and spread it over Clara's shoulders with the careful, serious competence of someone who understood that this was not a time for crying. There would be time for crying later. For now, there was only the job of staying close, and Lily had done it without being asked, for however many hours this had been going on, alone. When she looked up and saw Dante in the doorway, tall, dark-suited, tattooed, and wide-eyed in a way he would not have recognized on himself, she said nothing for a moment. Just looked at him with large brown eyes that were swollen from crying but had no more tears left in them. "You came." It was not a question. It was not relief exactly, either. It was something more careful than relief. The sound of a child who had hoped, and had not been entirely sure the hope was warranted. Warren was now simply registering, with great precision, that the outcome was real. "I came," Dante said. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched beside Clara, pressing 2 fingers to her throat. Her pulse was present but weak, stuttering like a signal in bad weather. Her skin was dry and warm in a way that suggested fever, and her breathing, up close, had a deep, labored quality, as if each inhale was a negotiation rather than an automatic act. He looked at the counter. There were 4 prescription bottles lined up against the wall, with the neatness of someone who had organized them deliberately, as if order could compensate for everything else. Dante picked the nearest one up and turned it over. The pharmacy label was faded and the expiration date was printed in small type at the bottom. 14 months ago. He picked up the next one. 11 months. The third. 8. He set them down without a word. She had been managing a life-threatening illness with expired medication. Not because she didn't know, because she couldn't afford to stop. The ambulance was already 4 minutes out. Kane had confirmed the ETA from the hallway, where he stood with the particular stillness of a man who understood that some rooms required him to wait outside. Dante stayed where he was, crouched on the floor beside Clara, and became aware that Lily had moved without a sound and was now sitting directly beside him. She looked at her mother's face for a moment. Then she reached over and took hold of Dante's hand. Not tentatively. Not the way a child reaches for a stranger's hand in uncertainty. She simply took it, wrapped her small fingers around 2 of his tattooed ones, and held on with the calm, total commitment of someone who had decided that this was where she was staying, and that was the end of the matter. Dante looked down at his hand, at her hand, at the contrast between them that could not have been more complete if it had been drawn, the ink and the size and the years between them, and her small fingers holding on as though he were the most reliable thing in the room. He did not pull away. He did not speak. He simply stayed where he was, on the floor of a 1-room apartment in the Bronx, and waited with her. The paramedics arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Dante knew, because he counted. Lily did not let go of his hand until the stretcher was through the door and Clara was on it with an oxygen mask over her face and 2 paramedics working efficiently on either side of her. Only then did Lily release him, not because she wanted to, Dante could tell, but because she needed both hands to push herself to her feet so she could see her mother's face. "Is she going to wake up?" Lily asked the nearest paramedic. She asked it quietly and directly, the way children ask hard questions when they have already braced themselves for the answer. The paramedic, a woman in her 30s with a practical face and kind eyes, glanced briefly at Dante, then back at Lily. "We're going to take very good care of her," she said. Lily considered this answer with the seriousness it deserved. Then she nodded, once, and went to find her shoes. The hospital was 20 minutes from the apartment. Dante rode in the back of Kane's car with Lily buckled into the seat beside him. She had climbed in on her own, with a small backpack that she had packed while the paramedics worked, moving through the apartment with the focused economy of a child who had learned not to waste time on things she could not control. She had packed a stuffed rabbit with one ear longer than the other, a box of crayons missing the brown, and a folded piece of paper that she held in her lap the entire ride without opening. She did not cry in the car. She looked out the window at the city sliding past and asked, after a long silence, whether the hospital would have orange juice. Dante told her he would make sure of it. She accepted this without further comment and returned to the window. The attending physician who came out to speak with Dante 2 hours later was a compact man in his late 40s named Dr. Reyes, who had the careful, measured delivery of someone accustomed to saying difficult things to people who were not prepared to hear them. He had asked twice, in the first minutes, whether Dante was family. Dante had said yes both times without elaborating, and Dr. Reyes had decided, with the pragmatism of a man who had worked emergency medicine for 20 years, that this was not the moment for paperwork. Clara Dawson, Dr. Reyes explained, was in a critical diabetic crisis, severe diabetic ketoacidosis, which occurred when the body, unable to use glucose properly, began breaking down fat at a rate that flooded the bloodstream with toxic acidic compounds. Left untreated, it was fatal. The progression in Clara's case suggested she had been deteriorating for somewhere between 48 and 72 hours before losing consciousness. Her medication had been expired long enough that it had provided only partial management of her condition, slowing the decline without arresting it. She was stable now, Dr. Reyes said. She was on IV fluids and insulin. Her numbers were moving in the right direction. If she had gone another 3 or 4 hours, Dr. Reyes said, we would not be having this conversation. Dante stood in the corridor outside the waiting room with his hands in his pockets, and let that land where it landed. 3 or 4 hours. He had called to fire her on the 3rd day. He had very nearly not called at all. Ray Coulter had suggested simply mailing a termination letter to save time. Dante had overruled him on principle because dismissals were delivered directly in his organization, not sent in envelopes. He had done it for reasons of protocol, of efficiency, of institutional discipline. Clara Dawson was alive because Dante Rourke had a policy about proper dismissal procedures. He was not sure, standing in that corridor, whether that fact made him feel better or considerably worse. He thanked Dr. Reyes, who nodded and returned to his work. Dante walked back to the waiting room. Lily was sitting in a plastic chair with her legs swinging because they did not quite reach the floor, eating the orange juice he had arranged through cane, and drawing on the back of the folded paper she had carried from the apartment. She did not look up when he sat down beside her, but she shifted slightly in her seat. A small, unconscious adjustment, moving incrementally closer. Is she going to wake up? Lily asked again, still quiet, still direct. This time, Dante had an answer that was true. Yes, he said. She is. Lily nodded slowly, processing this with the same careful gravity she applied to everything. Then she held up the paper she had been drawing on. It was a butterfly, rendered in orange crayon, slightly lopsided, wings uneven, but recognizably and committedly a butterfly. I'm drawing this for when Mommy wakes up, she said. She likes butterflies. She says they mean things get better. Dante looked at the drawing for a moment. He said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and he was beginning to learn that Lily did not require him to fill silences, only to stay in them. 40 minutes later, a social worker named Patricia arrived at the nurse's station and introduced herself to Dante with the brisk, pre-organized energy of someone who had done this particular intake process many times before. She had a clipboard, a lanyard, and the pleasant professional manner of a person who managed difficult situations by never allowing them to become personal. She explained that given Clara's status and the absence of any listed emergency contacts, she would need to arrange temporary placement for the child through the city's emergency foster system. It was standard procedure. It could be processed tonight. There was a family in Woodside that regularly took short-term placements. Lily would be comfortable. Dante listened to all of this without interrupting. When Patricia finished, he looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had a way of making people feel they were being read rather than looked at. What would she need from me? He asked. To go home with me instead. Patricia blinked. Sir, without a prior relationship established in the system, Then let's establish it, Dante said, without raising his voice, without shifting in his seat, with the absolute calm of a man who had decided something and was simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. I have a fully staffed residence, a secure building, and no intention of this child going anywhere unfamiliar tonight while her mother is in a hospital bed. Tell me what paperwork is required. Patricia looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Lily, who was watching this exchange from her plastic chair with the alert, immeasuring attention of a child who understood more than adults generally assumed she did. Then Patricia made a note on her clipboard. There were forms, there were calls, there was a supervising caseworker who needed to be reached, and a duty manager who needed to authorize, and a verification process that Kane handled from the corridor with the efficient ruthlessness he applied to all logistical problems. It took 90 minutes. Dante sat in the waiting room for all of it, beside Lily, who finished the butterfly and started a second one, this time in blue. At just past 8 o'clock in the evening, with the paperwork signed and the emergency temporary authorization in place, Dante stood and held out his hand to Lily. She slid off the plastic chair, tucked the butterfly drawings carefully into her backpack, and took his hand. They walked out of the hospital into the cold Manhattan night. The most feared man in 3 boroughs and a 5-year-old girl who was not afraid of him at all, and got into the car. Kane glanced in the rearview mirror as he pulled out of the parking structure. In the back seat, Lily had already fallen asleep against Dante's arm, her backpack in her lap, and her small hand still loosely holding 2 of his fingers. Dante was looking straight ahead, jaw set, expression unreadable in the way it always was. Except that Kane had spent 11 years learning to read what unreadable looked like on that face, and this was not it. This was something else. Something quieter. Something that had not been there this morning. Kane said nothing. He drove. 42 floors up, a dismissal form still lay on the floor where it had fallen. It would still be there in the morning. No one would pick it up for 3 days. And by then, it would not matter. She had never been to Dante Rourke's penthouse. She had never seen a building that tall, a room that large, or a man that still, who was also somehow and without warning, kind. But all of that was tomorrow. Tonight, Lily slept. And Dante, for the first time in a very long time, did not look like a man who was waiting for something bad to happen. Lily woke up before Dante did. He discovered this at 6:14 in the morning when he came out of his bedroom to find her standing in the middle of the living room in her socks, turning slowly in a full circle with her head tilted back, taking in the penthouse the way an architect might assess a building, with interest, but without awe. The floor-to-ceiling windows were filled with early Manhattan light. The city sprawled 42 floors below, a grid of glass and steel that had made grown men go quiet upon first seeing it. Lily looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, then turned to Dante. "Do you have crackers?" He did not have crackers. He had a sub-zero refrigerator stocked by a private chef who came 3 mornings a week, a wine cooler that held 46 bottles, and a pantry containing 8 varieties of imported olive oil. He did not have crackers. He sent Kane a message at 6:15 in the morning that said only, "Crackers. All kinds." Kane, to his credit, asked no questions. While they waited, Dante made toast, which he had not done himself in approximately 4 years. He burned the first 2 slices and said nothing about it. Lily watched him from the kitchen counter where she was sitting. He had lifted her up without thinking, the way you would, and she had settled there with the comfort of someone who considered kitchen counters a perfectly reasonable place to be. And when the toast came out charred at the edges, she examined it with the clinical honesty of a 5-year-old. "It's a little brown," she said. "I know. Mommy burns it sometimes too." A pause. "She says it's still good with butter." "She's right," Dante said, and buttered it. They ate the burned toast together, standing at the kitchen counter in the early morning quiet, and Dante found that it was the most uncomplicated meal he had eaten in longer than he could honestly account for. By the end of the first day, she had named the large fiddle-leaf fig in the corner of the living room Gerald. She announced this to Dante with the tone of someone concluding a matter that had been pending for some time, as though the plant had been waiting for the name, and she had simply arrived to provide it. Dante looked at the plant, which had cost $400 and had been selected by an interior designer he had never met, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Gerald it was. On the second day, she reorganized his bookshelves. He came home at 7 in the evening to find her standing on the bottom shelf, using it as a step, with the pragmatic problem-solving of a child who will not be defeated by height, pulling books out and lining them along the floor in order of their color. The shelves that remained held the books she had already repositioned, warm reds and oranges on the left, bleeding through yellows and greens toward the right, with a small section of blues at the far end that she was clearly very pleased with. Dante stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Those were organized by subject," he said. Lily looked at the existing arrangement, then at him, with an expression of polite but firm disagreement. "This is better," she said, and returned to work. Dante went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and came back and sat on the couch and watched her finish it. She worked with the absorbed, total concentration that children bring to tasks they have decided are important, occasionally stepping back to assess the overall effect with her hands on her hips. When she was done, she stood before the shelves for a long, satisfied moment, then nodded once with the authority of a person closing a meeting. "Better," she said again, to no one in particular. He did not disagree. On the third morning, over the scrambled eggs that Dante had made with slightly more success than the toast, Lily looked up at him from across the kitchen island and said, with the conversational ease of someone raising a topic that had been on her mind for a while, "Why do you always look like you're waiting for something bad to happen?" Dante set his fork down. He looked at her, at this small person with brown eyes and sleep-flattened hair who was eating her eggs with the methodical dedication she brought to everything, as though eating well were a responsibility she took seriously. And he found that he had no answer. Not a deflection, not a dismissal, not the kind of smooth redirect he deployed 100 times a day in rooms full of men who asked far more dangerous questions than this one. Nothing. Just the quiet, faintly vertiginous sensation of having been seen clearly by someone who had no idea how rare that was. "I don't know," he said. Lily considered this. "Mommy says that when you carry too much, your face gets tired. Your mother is very wise. She's also good at math." She returned to her eggs. "You should try smiling. It helps. I looked it up in a book." "You can read?" She gave him a look of magnificent patience. "I'm 5, not a baby." He had been reviewing Clara's employment file for different reasons than he originally intended. In what had begun as a procedural review, the kind of administrative audit he ran whenever an employee situation became complicated, had become something else entirely by the second day. He had pulled the full record, her hiring documents, her shift logs, her payroll history. He had cross-referenced it with the maintenance schedule for the penthouse and the cleaning invoices, and the timestamps from the building's keycard system, which logged every entry and exit. Clara Dawson had not missed a single day of work in 11 months, not one. She had come in early on 4 occasions. She had stayed late twice without billing for the overtime. The 3 consecutive absences that had prompted his call were the first disruption in a record of attendance so consistent it was almost architectural. He sat with that for a long time. Then he pulled the personnel files on his other domestic and administrative staff, 12 people in total, ranging from his building manager to the 2 rotating security guards who staffed the lobby. He asked Ray Coulter, with careful and deliberate casualness, to do a general wellness check across all household staff. Frame it as a routine thing, he told Ray, just making sure everyone has what they need. Ray had come back to him the following afternoon with the kind of expression that suggested the results had surprised him, which told Dante they were going to surprise him too. 3 people. His building manager, a 41-year-old named Stuart, had been managing a back injury for 7 months. He had been taking over-the-counter painkillers at doses that were not medically appropriate because he could not afford the time off that a proper treatment plan would require, and did not believe he could ask for it. His handwriting on the maintenance logs had changed over the past 4 months. Dante had reviewed those logs every week without noticing. One of the lobby guards, Marcus, 28 years old, had a family financial emergency. A mother in the hospital in another state, bills accumulating, and had been working double shifts to cover it without telling anyone, running on 4 hours of sleep for the better part of 6 weeks. His performance reviews were spotless. He had not asked for help. And Dante's housekeeper, Patricia, a different Patricia from the social worker, and a woman who had worked in the building for 3 years, had been dealing with a family crisis at home involving her teenage son, the details of which she had kept entirely to herself, and which had clearly been affecting her in ways Dante could now, looking back at her recent work, recognize as visible signs of distress that he had simply never looked at closely enough to see. None of them had said a word. Not one of them had asked for a day off, a schedule adjustment, a conversation, a loan, an accommodation of any kind. They had all simply absorbed whatever was happening in their lives and kept performing, because the alternative, the idea of bringing a personal problem to Dante Rourke's attention, had apparently never presented itself as a viable option. Dante read through Ray's notes a second time, then a third. He had built this. He understood. Not through malice, not through any conscious policy of cruelty. He had built it through 42 years of demonstrating, consistently and without exception, that performance was the only currency he recognized, and that anything which interfered with performance was, by definition, a problem to be solved or removed. He had never said, "Do not tell me when you are struggling." He had never needed to. He had communicated it in every other way available, in every dismissal, every cold decision, every room he had walked through without looking at the people in it. The message had arrived, clearly and completely, without him ever sending it. Fear, it turned out, was an exceptionally efficient communicator. The most dangerous thing about a culture built on it, he was beginning to understand, was not that people stopped working. And they didn't. They worked harder. They worked longer. They worked through injuries and grief and financial collapse and personal emergencies, because the fear of what would happen if they didn't was a more immediate force than any of the things that were actually happening to them. The machine kept running. The output stayed consistent. And underneath it, quietly and invisibly, everything structural was starting to rot. He thought about the medication bottles on Clara's counter, the expiration dates. 11 months of coming to work in silence, managing a life-threatening condition with expired medication, keeping it invisible, keeping her head down, being, in every measurable sense, an exemplary employee. And the thing that had made all of it necessary was simply the knowledge that he was her boss. He closed the file. He sat in his office for a long time without moving. Gerald the fiddle-leaf fig stood in the corner of the living room, 40 feet away, and did not offer an opinion. Victor Harlow had noticed the change before most people were aware there was a change to notice. That was Victor's particular skill. He read rooms before the furniture had finished settling, which was why Dante had brought him on as second-in-command 11 years ago, and which was also precisely why Victor was dangerous now that the rooms were settling in directions he did not control. He was 51, silver-haired, and carried himself with the polished ease of a man who had spent decades being the second most important person in every room he entered and had made his peace with it, or had appeared to. The girl in the penthouse was 3 days old as a fact, and already Victor had built a case around her. He had not moved openly. Victor never moved openly. That was the first thing Dante had ever taught him, and Victor had learned it completely and was now, with quiet amusement, applying it back. He had begun with conversation, careful, planted observations in casual exchanges with the capos. Dante's been distracted. Dante canceled the Harlow meeting. Yes, again. You heard about the girl? The maid's daughter. He's got a child in the penthouse apparently. The word apparently doing its particular work. Seeding doubt without the clumsiness of an accusation. A good man, Victor. Concerned. Just raising things others were probably thinking. By the third day, 2 of the 5 capos had quietly repositioned themselves. Not defection. Nothing so visible. Nothing that would require them to show their hand. Just a recalibration, a slight reorientation toward a center of gravity that might soon be in a different place. Fealty, in Dante's world, had always been partly practical, and practicality responded to signals. The signal Victor was sending was simple and very old. The king is soft. The king is distracted. And soft, distracted kings do not stay kings. Cain brought this intelligence to Dante on the 4th evening, sitting across from him in the office with the directness that 11 years of absolute trust had earned him. He laid out what he knew, the conversations, the names, the topology of the quiet realignment. And Dante listened without interruption, as he always did, his face giving nothing away, as it always did. When Cain finished, Dante was silent for a moment. From the living room came the sound of Lily, who had appointed herself Gerald's official caretaker and was explaining to the plant, with great patience and apparent thoroughness, that he needed to be watered consistently and in the same spot, and not moved around too much because that stressed plants out. She had read this, she explained to Gerald in a book on the shelf. The green section. Dante almost smiled. Where does Victor think he is? He said quietly. Cain understood the question. He thinks you're somewhere else. Good, Dante said. Let him keep thinking that. He rose from the desk and went to check on Lily and Gerald, and Cain remained behind in the empty office, turning that single word over in his mind. Good. Not will handle it. Not get me names. Not the particular hardening of posture that meant someone was about to have a very bad week. Just good. The word of a man who had already decided how this ended, who had in fact been watching the whole time, and who had simply needed everyone around him to believe, for a little while longer, that he hadn't. Victor Harlow was making his move. He had badly miscalculated what Dante Rourke looked like when he was paying attention. The restaurant was called Ardea, and it was the kind of place that did not advertise, did not maintain a public reservation system, and did not appear in any review publication that ordinary people read. Its dining room held 6 tables. On any given evening, the people seated at them collectively controlled more of the city's actual machinery than the entire municipal government did. Dante had eaten there perhaps 40 times. He had chosen it tonight because Victor would interpret the choice as a concession, neutral ground, a gesture of collegial respect, and because Victor, like most people who believed they were winning, had stopped questioning the gifts he was given. The 5 capos arrived between 8 and 8:15. Victor arrived at 8:20, which was 4 minutes later than the time Dante had specified, and which was either a small assertion of status or simple carelessness. Dante had long since concluded there was no such thing as carelessness in Victor Harlow. He noted the 4 minutes and said nothing. They ordered. They ate the first course. Dante spoke about ordinary things. A logistics matter in one of the warehouses. A zoning issue with one of the legitimate businesses on the west side. And was, to all appearances, entirely present and entirely untroubled, which was the most unsettling version of Dante that people who knew him well had learned to be wary of. The two capos who had shifted their weight toward Victor over the past week were watching him with the careful, peripheral attention of men trying to gauge something without appearing to gauge it. Victor waited until the second course had been served and the staff had withdrawn. Then he set down his fork, touched his mouth with his napkin, and began. He was very good at it. Dante had always known this, had in fact relied on it for years, and watching it deployed against him now, he felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite contempt, but occupied the narrow space between them. Victor did not attack. He expressed concern. He raised questions. The kind that sounded reasonable when spoken aloud in a room full of men who were already half convinced, the kind that arrived wearing the clothes of loyalty while doing the work of something else entirely. He talked about the cancelled meetings, the shifted priorities, the optics of a man in Dante's position housing a domestic worker's child in his penthouse, while the organization's quarterly decisions went unmade. He talked about the importance of perception. He talked about the message that leadership sent through its choices, and the messages, he said carefully, that certain recent choices had been sending. He did not say soft. He didn't need to. The word was present in every sentence like a frequency just below hearing. He concluded by saying that he raised these things not as a challenge, but as a colleague and a friend, because the organization's strength depended on its leadership being beyond question, and because some of the men at this table, he did not look at the two capos, but everyone knew, had questions that deserved to be addressed honestly, and in this room, rather than somewhere less constructive. He picked up his fork. The table was quiet. Dante let the quiet sit for a moment. He was looking at the candle in the center of the table, and his expression was the one that Cain would have recognized immediately, and that the two repositioned capos were only now beginning to understand was not passivity. It was the expression of a man who had arrived knowing exactly where everything in the room was, including the exits. He looked up. "Are you finished?" he said. Victor met his eyes. "I am." "Good." Dante reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. 4 pages, dense with figures, printed cleanly without any header or identifying mark. He unfolded it and set it flat on the table beside his plate without looking at it, because he did not need to look at it. He had read it many times. "Over the past 2 weeks," he said with the same tone he might use to discuss the zoning matter from earlier, "I've identified a consistent discrepancy across 3 of our operations. The Riverside figures are short by 11% across 6 consecutive quarters. The harbor arrangement, the revised harbor arrangement, the one that was renegotiated 14 months ago by a single representative without a full room present, is generating revenue that does not appear in any account I have authorization to review. And there is a relationship with the Ferris organization on the east side that I was not informed of and did not authorize, which has been producing a secondary income stream for approximately 8 months." He paused. He looked at Victor with the same unhurried attention he had been giving the candle. "The common element in all 3, he said, is you." The room did not move. It was the particular stillness of people who are controlling very carefully how much of what they are feeling is visible on their faces. Victor's face was doing something complicated. The polished concern, the collegial ease, these were still technically present. But they had the quality of a coat that no longer fit quite right, the seams showing under pressure they had not been made to absorb. He opened his mouth. "Those figures require context." "I'm sure they do," Dante said pleasantly. "You're welcome to provide it. I've set aside the remainder of the evening." Victor closed his mouth. The silence that followed was the most complete Dante had produced in a room in recent memory, and he had produced some significant silences over the course of his career. The 2 capos who had been quietly realigning their loyalties were now sitting with the very still posture of men who were reassessing a series of recent decisions with considerable urgency. The other 3 were watching Dante with the alert, A focused attention of people watching someone they had underestimated reveal the actual dimensions of what they were. Dante refolded the document. He set it on the table between himself and Victor, not as an offer, and not as a threat, but as the plainest possible statement of what existed and could not now be made not to exist. "Here is what I'm prepared to do," he said. "You have given this organization 11 years. Some of that work was genuinely good, and I won't pretend otherwise. What you've done in the last several months is a different category of thing, and we both understand that. I'm not going to explain to anyone in this room what the standard consequence for that category of thing looks like. They already know." No one at the table moved. "What I'm offering instead is this: a formal retirement, announced in whatever language preserves your dignity, full financial severance on the terms of your original agreement, and your continued good health, which I consider a generous addendum given the circumstances. In exchange, you are out of this city in 48 hours and you do not come back." He picked up his wine glass. "That offer is available for approximately the next 60 seconds, after which I become considerably less interested in your comfort." Victor Harlow looked at the document on the table. He looked at the room, at the capos, who were all, without exception, looking at Dante now, with the particular quality of attention that meant they had already decided where they stood. He looked at Dante, who was drinking his wine with perfect calm and waiting. Whatever calculation Victor ran in those seconds, it reached its conclusion quickly. He was a man who had spent his career reading the geometry of power in rooms, and the geometry of this room was not ambiguous. "I'll need a week to organize." 48 hours, Dante said. A long pause. Then Victor nodded. Once, with the careful dignity of a man who has chosen the terms of a defeat and is determined to wear them as something that resembles a choice. He put his napkin on the table. He stood. He left without finishing his dinner, and the door of Ardea closed behind him with a sound that was, in the context, remarkably final. Dante set down his wine glass. He looked at the remaining men at the table, at the 2 who had wavered and the 3 who had not. And when he spoke, his voice held none of the cold that they had been bracing for, which was, in its own way, more commanding than cold would have been. "I didn't get soft," he said. "I got smarter. There is a difference. And anyone who cannot tell the difference is not someone I need at this table." He picked up his fork and returned to his dinner, and one by one, so did they. Clara Dawson was discharged on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week, on a day that was cold and bright in the particular way of early New York winter. The sky an almost aggressive blue above buildings that looked like they had been cut from something harder. She came out of the hospital's main entrance in a coat that was not her own. Dante had sent Kane with it, 2 weeks into her stay, because the coat she had arrived in had not been adequate for the temperature, and no one had thought to mention it until Lily did. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her face turned up toward the sky, like someone relearning what open space felt like. The care plan went with her. A proper endocrinologist, a pharmacy account that refilled automatically without a balance to manage, scheduled check-ins with a diabetes educator over the next 6 months. Dr. Reyes had overseen the transition personally, with a thoroughness that suggested he had been given very clear instructions about thoroughness, and he had shaken Clara's hand at discharge with the warmth of a man who understood that a good outcome here had required more than medicine. She had been told, in careful increments over the 6 weeks, what had happened, what Dante had found, what he had done. She had processed it with the quietly overwhelming quality of someone assembling a picture they had not expected to be as large as it was. She had cried, twice, in conversations with a hospital social worker, and had said very little to Dante directly on his visits. She was formal with him, still in the specific way of someone who had spent 11 months making herself invisible to a person who was now, inexplicably, responsible for the fact that she was breathing. The formality was not ingratitude. It was the careful navigation of a distance that no longer existed in the same shape it once had, and neither of them quite knew yet what shape it was becoming. The legal arrangement was drawn up by a firm Dante retained for matters requiring both precision and discretion. It was not guardianship. Clara was Lily's mother, present and recovering and fully capable, and there was no legal basis or human justification for anything that would alter that fundamental fact. What was drawn up instead was a support structure, a trust in Lily's name covering her education through university, a healthcare provision covering Clara for the next 10 years with zero out-of-pocket costs, and a housing arrangement, a proper apartment, a lease held in a manner that was stable and permanent and not dependent on continued employment by anyone. That meant the particular fear Clara had been living with, the fear that losing a job meant losing a home, was simply no longer a variable in her life. Clara had read the document 3 times before signing it. Then she had looked at Dante across the lawyer's desk with an expression he found difficult to characterize. Not gratitude exactly, though that was present, but something underneath it that was harder and more honest. The look of a woman who understood what the document represented and also understood what its existence meant about the period before it existed, and who had decided to hold both of those things without letting one cancel out the other. "Thank you," she said. It was the most direct thing she had said to him in 7 weeks. "I'm sorry it took this long," Dante said. It was the most honest thing he had said to almost anyone in considerably longer. He called Marco on a Thursday evening from the office, be sitting at the desk where the dismissal form had once fallen to the floor, and where Gerald's predecessor had been eventually relocated to the hallway to make room for a smaller pot of whatever Lily had decided they were growing next. He had composed nothing in advance. He had learned, recently, that composing things in advance was a way of controlling for a response, rather than genuinely inviting one, and that the distinction mattered more than he had historically been willing to admit. The phone rang 4 times, and Dante was preparing for voicemail when Marco answered. "Dad." The word landed the way it always did, with the specific weight of something that had once been easier and was now navigated carefully by both of them, carrying the history of all the times it had gone unsaid. Marco was 19. He had his mother's directness and Dante's eyes, and a quality of self-possession that Dante recognized and took no credit for, because his ex-wife had built that in their son, largely in the space that Dante had vacated. "I wanted to call," Dante said. "Not about anything specific. I just wanted to call." A pause. "Okay. I've been thinking about some things. About the way I've done things. I'm not going to deliver a speech about it. You don't need that, and neither do I. But I wanted you to know that I'm aware of what I've missed. And I'm not trying to renegotiate history. I'm just..." He stopped. Found the word. "Here, if that means anything." Another pause. Longer. The particular silence of someone deciding how much to meet the thing they are being offered. "There's this girl," Marco said finally. "Lily, right? Mom told me. She said you've got a 5-year-old reorganizing your apartment. My bookshelves are now organized by color." Marco made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost? That's insane. She also named my plant Gerald." This time it was a laugh, small and real and surprised out of him rather than given, which was the best kind. "I'll come up," Marco said. "Not soon, but I'll come." "Whenever you're ready," Dante said. "I'll be here." He hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, with the quiet that was different from other quiet. Fuller somehow, less like absence, and more like room. On Sunday morning, Lily taught Dante how to draw a butterfly. She had assembled the materials with the organizational seriousness he had come to recognize as her natural register. Crayons laid out by color, paper squared up on the kitchen island, an extra sheet set aside for mistakes, which she told him were normal and not a problem. She demonstrated first, producing a butterfly of confident elegance, wings balanced and antennae precise, the whole thing accomplished in about 45 seconds with the easy mastery of someone who had been drawing butterflies as long as she could remember, which was most of her life. Then she handed him the orange crayon. Dante Rourke, who controlled 3 boroughs, who had outmaneuvered federal investigators and dismantled an internal coup without raising his voice, looked at the blank page and drew the most asymmetrical butterfly in the history of the form. One wing was approximately twice the size of the other. The antennae went in directions that antennae did not naturally go, and the body was too long and vaguely suggested a different insect entirely. Lily studied it with the focused, impartial attention of a professional evaluator. "The wings need to match," she said. "I see that. And the antennae come from the top." "Right. But the color is good." She pointed at the orange. Orange is her favorite. He looked up. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway in the good coat, coffee in both hands, watching them. She had arrived 20 minutes ago, which was the new arrangement on Sunday mornings. Easy, unscheduled, without the formality that had characterized the early weeks. She was not fully well yet. That would take time, and she knew it. And the doctor had said it plainly, and she had heard it plainly and was living accordingly, which was itself a new thing. She looked, in the kitchen doorway in the winter light, like someone who had been handed a version of her life that she was still, quietly and carefully, learning how to hold. She met his eyes over Lily's head. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. "Try again," Lily said, and slid him a fresh sheet of paper. He tried again. It was marginally better. She was delighted anyway, in the total, uncomplicated way that children are delighted by effort. Not because the result is good, but because the trying is real, and she knew the difference, and it mattered to her. Outside, Manhattan went about its Sunday business 42 floors below, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that anything had changed. But things had changed, in the way that real changes happen. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. Each one unremarkable on its own, building into something that could not be undone, and that, examined from any honest angle, was nothing other than good. The most feared man in New York was drawing butterflies at his kitchen island, doing it badly, and sitting still for the correction. And he was, in every way that had ever meant anything, exactly where he was supposed to be. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.